This week's Torah portion is called Chaya. I want to start, before I start talking about this week's Torah portion, I want to just recap a little bit about something that happened in last week's Parsha. So we learnt last week about Abraham, our forefather, who circumcises himself on the command of God, and he's sitting by the tent, recuperating, and three angels disguised as men come towards him, and he gets up and he runs to take care of them. We talked about the hospitality of Abraham and Sarah and how they took care of their guests, and he runs to go take care of them. And one of the things that it says in our medrash is that he wanted to take a calf and he wanted to use that to feed his guests with. And so he goes to find a calf, and the calf runs away from him, and he runs after this calf. So you have this image of Avraham Avinu, our forefather, running after this calf because he wants to give this calf as food, delicious fresh food to his guests, and he runs after the calf, and the calf runs into a cave, and he goes into the cave after Avraham Avinu, and inside, after the calf, Avraham Avinu runs into the cave after the calf. And what we learn is that this was the cave of Machpelah. This was the cave where Adam and Eve were buried, and Abraham sees Adam and Eve buried there, and he smells a beautiful fragrance, and he recognizes that this is the entrance way to the Garden of Eden, and it's a special and it's a holy place, and Adam and Eve are buried here. He catches the calf, he takes it home, he prepares it for his guests, he gives it to his guests. At the end of last week's Parsha, we read about the binding of Isaac, where Isaac is commanded by God to take his son, his only son, the one he loves, Isaac, and to offer him as a sacrifice. He doesn't offer him as a sacrifice. But at the beginning of this week's Parsha, we read about the death of Sarah, his wife, Sarah, our foremother. That she, apparently, according to many commentators, felt or knew what Isaac was where he was going, or what Abraham was doing with Isaac, and she had such fright from this news, from this imagery of her son being offered as a sacrifice, and she dies from a heart attack. She dies from grief. Because this week's Parsha, there's this abrupt death of Sarah, our foremother, and because it's juxtaposed with the binding of Isaac, it's assumed that it was the shock of what Abraham was doing that caused her to die. Abraham comes, he sees, he understands, he finds out that his wife has died, and what does he do? It says in the Torah that he eulogizes her. And then he cries. He eulogizes her first. He speaks about her character. He speaks about who she was, what a partner she was to him, how they were able to collect souls and bring people to ethical monotheism and understand the one God and all the things that they did together. And he recognizes through his eulogizing her what he had and now what he didn't have. And it says that he eulogizes her and then he cries. And because of understanding who she was and what she brought to the world, and how she was the foremother of the Jewish people, and how she was an amazing partner, and they were in this together and they were doing everything together. Through all of that, through the eulogies, through speaking it out, he came to understand who she was, and then he cries. So oftentimes we lose people, we cry first and then we eulogize. But there's something to learn here about the order within which Abraham eulogizes and then he cries. And then it says he gets up. And it's interesting because we say, when a person sits shiva, we say, when are you getting up? When are you getting up? It's the same language. Abraham gets up, and what's he going to do next? He has to buy a burial place for Sarah. And he wants to bury her in the cave from last week's Parsha where he ran after the calf. That cave where Adam and Eve are buried, that cave which is the entrance to the Garden of Eden. He wants to bury his loved one, his Sarah, in that cave. And he goes to Ephron, who owns the cave, owns the land, and he negotiates, and it's a hard negotiation, but it's not important. Money is not important to Abraham. What's important to him is that he should bury his beloved Sarah in this cave, in this special holy place. That place is priceless. It's worth all the money that he has. It doesn't matter to him. Ephron, who he's negotiating with, wants the money. That's what he's concerned with. But we understand that Abraham was concerned not about money, but about this priceless real estate. This is the first time in the Torah where we read about someone purchasing a burial place. And we learn 6 times, I think actually 6 or 7 times, over and over and over again, we read the phraseology of Abraham and burying his dead, that you bury our dead, that we bury our dead. Over and over and over again, we learn the importance of burying our dead, how important that is. And speaks a little bit back to this idea of eulogizing. The idea of eulogizing is, on the one hand, to recognize what it is that we've lost and to cry over that loss, but also to be inspired by the person that we've lost. Who was this person? Who were they in the world? What did they do? What values did they have? And when we recognize what we've lost, when we recognize who this person is and we're inspired by them, then we continue their legacy. We continue their values in the world. We become, quote unquote, the feet for our deceased in the world. We continue to bring them into the world. And it says that our holy people, our righteous people, good people, they don't die. And when they die, they're not really dead. They're still living, because their legacy is their values and who they were and what they brought into the world. And so too, we should think about what it is that we're willing to die for, and then live for those things, because that's how we continue to live beyond our physical reality in this world, is by who we are and what we do and what we bring into the world, the values that we hold dear and that we are known for. And so we eulogize, and so we have a yard site where we remember the person. We have Yiska, where we remember the person in synagogue. At certain points in the Jewish calendar, we go to synagogue, we remember our departed, and we have a grave site to go to, because we bury our dead. And when we bury our dead and we have a grave site, we go to the grave side. And there's a teaching that the lower aspects of a person's soul, even though the higher aspects have gone up into the higher olamos and the higher realms, that the lower parts stay by the grave. And we go to the grave, and we can ask the person to pray to God for us, to take our prayers up. We can remember who the person was and continue to be inspired by them, to continue to have their life be meaningful, and continue for their legacy to continue in the world by having a grave to go to, by remembering who they are, by reliving the lessons. So that's the first half of the Torah portion. The second half of the Torah portion, Abraham gets up, and now what's he going to do? Now he has to find a wife for his and Sarah's son Isaac. He sends Eliezer, comes back, he marries, and Isaac marries Rebecca. And it says in the Torah, again, the language is flipped over. It says that Isaac married Rebecca and then he loved her. And we perhaps live in an age where we love somebody and then we marry them. But there's something to learn about marrying and then loving, that through the marriage, through the commitment, through the faithfulness, through the time that we spend with another person, we get to know them, we get to live life with them, we get to do projects together, we get to travel through life together. Through that journey, we come to love them by giving to them, by being in relationship to them. And we might not have it when we first get married. We get married, we're in lust, or we're beginning phases of love, but it's through the maturing and the growing together that we actually come to love somebody. And so that's what we can learn with that upside down language again, where it says that Isaac married Rebecca and then he loved her. So those are the two messages that I want to bring out, that sometimes we don't recognize what we have until we lose it, and maybe we should work harder to recognize the blessings that we have before we lose what we have, or hopefully we won't lose them. But when we have them, we should recognize the value of them and be grateful for them, and feel so blessed to have people in our lives who help us be the best that we can be and help us in our journey. And then we'll come to love them even more and more, and we'll eulogize them at the end if we outlive them, and we'll cry tears because we've loved them, and then we'll get up and we'll keep going, we'll keep building. Abraham was promised by God over and over again that he would have a land and that he would have many descendants, like the stars in the sky and like the sand on the seashore. And at the end of his life, he only had Isaac, who was the progenitor of the promise of to be a great nation, and he only had that little piece of land that he purchased in this week's Torah portion to bury Sarah in, and later he's buried in that cave. And at the end of this week's Parsha, we learn of the death of Abraham, who is also buried in the cave along with his beloved Sarah.